The Velhari cluster was a graveyard of dead stars, a region most civilizations had marked on their charts with a simple warning: do not enter. The Galactic Conclave had abandoned Kellereth Station 17 years ago after a microsingularity collapsed the nearby jump gate, leaving the structure drifting, powerless and forgotten among clouds of ionized debris. Lieutenant Commander Salvara Kane pressed her back against the scorched bulkhead and listened to the silence. She was not Velhari. She was not Conclave-born. She was human, one of the 214 crew members aboard the U.S. Mirantis, a mid-range exploration vessel that had stumbled upon Kellereth 9 while mapping gravitational anomalies in this forgotten corner of the galaxy. "Contact on sensors," whispered Ensign Doran Quast from behind a collapsed support strut. He was 23 years old, freckled, and trying very hard not to breathe too loudly. Multiple biosignatures. Not human. Salvara already knew. She could feel them, the pressure change in the air recyclers, the faint vibration through the deck plating. Something large was moving through the station's lower decks. They had not come to Kellereth 9 alone. The Therakine were an amphibious species, wide-set golden eyes, four-limbed frames wrapped in iridescent membrane skin that shifted between deep violet and pale green depending on emotional state. They communicated in a layered dialect of harmonics and subvocalizations, and they were, by their own estimation, among the most advanced biological species in the known conclave. They were also absolutely convinced that humans were some kind of primitive curiosity, a species that had stumbled into FTL travel by accident, barely capable of maintaining their own ships, and certainly not worth a second glance in the galactic hierarchy. Sub-Commander Vareth Kalas had led his scouting team to Kellereth 9 for one reason: a Therakine research cache left behind before the evacuation. He had not expected to find humans already aboard. He stepped into the corridor, 4 of his soldiers flanking him, their bioluminescent markings pulsing deep crimson, a display of dominance. "Primitive vessel crew," Vareth said through his translator node, his harmonics flattening to something resembling boredom. "You are trespassing in a Therakine-claimed recovery zone. Surrender your equipment and leave." Salvara stepped forward. She was not particularly tall by human standards, but she held herself like a person who had walked into burning buildings before and come out the other side. She probably had. "I was not aware the Therakine had filed a claim on a decommissioned conclave station," she said. "We are here on a survey mission. We will be out of your way shortly." Varetha's membranes flickered amber, mild irritation. "Your kind is always in the way. How you achieved spaceflight I will never comprehend. What happened next was not planned. It rarely was with humans." One of Varetha's soldiers, young and eager to impress, swung the butt of his resonance staff toward the young human ensign. A warning strike, nothing more, the kind of casual physical assertion that worked perfectly well on the dozens of other species the Therakine regularly encountered. The staff connected with Doran Quast's forearm with a crack that echoed down the corridor. The bone broke. Audibly. Even Salvara winced. Doran made a sound, a sharp hiss of pain, but he did not fall. He looked down at his arm. It was bent at an angle that made 2 of the Therakine soldiers step back instinctively. Then something remarkable happened. Doran straightened up. His face was pale, jaw clenched, sweat already beating at his temples. But he stood. He looked at his arm again. Then he looked directly at Vareth Kalas and said, through gritted teeth, "That is going to need a splint." Vareth stared. The young soldier who had struck him stared harder. "It is still standing," the soldier said quietly, his membranes cycling rapidly through confused yellows. "That strike would have incapacitated a Virian for weeks. A Garati would have gone into shock. Humans are apparently different," Vareth said slowly, something shifting behind his golden eyes. Salvara stepped between them, already pulling a field medical kit from her vest. "I told you we would be out of your way," she said calmly, crouching to stabilize Doran's arm. "We are not looking for trouble. We came here for the same reason you did: information. There may be enough for all of us." Vareth watched her work. Watched the human boy bite down on a piece of leather from his own bootstrap, a precaution against biting his own tongue, while she reset the bone with her bare hands, quick and practiced, and then locked a field splint around it. Doran breathed through his nose in long, deliberate cycles. Within minutes he was functional. Vareth had seen species survive grievous wounds before. But they had always collapsed first. Gone pale or blue or convulsed. They had needed time. They had needed others to carry them. This one had not. "What is the endurance threshold of your species?" Vareth asked, genuinely curious now despite himself. "Depends on the human," Salvara said. "Some of us are more stubborn than others." Doran laughed, actually laughed, and then winced. Do not make me laugh, he muttered. That still hurts. Vareth Kalas stood in the corridor of Kellereth station for a long moment, watching these two humans move together with practiced efficiency, mapping their environment, cataloging exits, maintaining situational awareness, all while one of them nursed a broken arm. He had cataloged hundreds of species. He had never seen anything quite like this. We will consider a temporary information-sharing arrangement, Vareth said finally. Salvara looked up and nodded once. Good. She did not smile. She did not gloat. She simply went back to work. Vareth turned to his second-in-command, Sub-Lieutenant Ariskel, and spoke in their native harmonics, too complex for the translator to catch. I want a full biological report on humans. Everything we have. I think we have been misinformed about them. Ariskel's membranes pulsed a thoughtful blue. What changed your mind? Vareth looked back at the young human, now securing his own field splint with his one good hand and a strip of torn uniform. He should be unconscious, Vareth said. He is not. That, he thought, was worth paying attention to. Therex 4 was not a pleasant place to live. It was barely a pleasant place to exist. The asteroid colony had been carved out of a nickel-iron rock 11 kilometers across, a warren of tunnels and pressurized chambers inhabited by workers from 6 different species under a galactic conclave extraction contract. The air tasted of machine oil and recycled breath. The gravity was artificial and slightly inconsistent near the outer corridors. And 3 weeks after the events at Kellereth Station, it was on fire. Not metaphorically. Literally, catastrophically on fire. A plasma conduit rupture in Level 7 had cascaded through the ventilation network with merciless efficiency. 4 of the colony's 11 emergency bulkheads had failed to seal. 17 workers were trapped in the processing hub. The temperature in the connecting corridor, the only viable route to reach them, was currently sitting at approximately 340 degrees Celsius. Dr. Yemisi Adaorabright stood at the entrance to that corridor in a standard EVA-rated thermal suit and made a face. 340, said the Therakine medic beside her, a junior field physician named Arasath, one of the rotating conclave health staff assigned to the colony. His membranes had gone a deep, near-white shade that indicated something close to horror. No biological entity can survive that. The humans must wait for the automated systems to. Automated systems have a 17-minute cycle, Yemisi said. 12 of those 17 people in there have a body temperature already rising. We do not have 17 minutes. Arasath stared at her. You cannot enter that corridor. I am not planning to enter it alone, Yemisi said. Then she turned to the 2 engineers behind her, Corporal Van Bakara and Specialist Oduya Kayamika, and said simply, "Ready?" Both of them nodded. All 3 pulled on additional heat-shielding layers over their suits. They were not rated for 340 degrees. Not even close. The rating ceiling on their equipment was 220. Arasath watched in something between fascination and disbelief as the 3 humans did something no Therakine combat doctrine would have sanctioned. They ran straight into the burning corridor anyway. The heat hit Yemisi like a physical wall. Even through her suit she could feel it pressing against her skin, searching for weaknesses. Her visor display was already throwing warnings in angry red text. Her suit's cooling system kicked into overdrive. She ignored all of it and ran. Fun was ahead of her, cutting through a secondary junction. Oduya was at the rear, carrying the emergency breather unit. The corridor groaned around them, superheated metal expanding in unpredictable ways. 60 seconds in, Fun's shoulder pad caught a secondary flame jet, a thin lance of plasma from a ruptured secondary line. It burned through his outer layer and scorched the skin beneath. He made a sound, stumbled, caught himself on the wall and kept moving. He kept moving. They reached the sealed door to the processing hub in 94 seconds. Yemisi's hands were shaking. Not from fear, she told herself, but from the thermal stress on her suit's glove systems. She keyed the override. The door groaned. She kicked it. It opened. 17 faces turned toward her, Garati, Virian, 2 humans and others, all of them gasping in air that, while dangerously hot, was at least breathable. We are getting you out, Yemisi said. Everyone who can walk, walk. Everyone who cannot, get next to someone who can carry you. We are going now. They went. On the way back, with Oduya leading a Garati worker whose weight was nearly 3 times hers, she had him over her shoulders in a carry that made the automated rescue drone assessors watching through corridor cameras flag her for a structural capacity review later. Yemisi heard the first of her suit's cooling cells fail. The temperature inside her suit climbed. She kept going. Arasath was waiting at the corridor exit. He pulled the first survivors through, got them to the medical station, turned back. And then he watched Yemisi walk out of the burning corridor with her suit half melted, Funbakara limping behind her with a visible burn along his left arm and neck, and Oduya still carrying the 300-kilogram garrote like it was simply the thing that needed to be done. Yemisi set the garrote down, turned to Arisath and said, "How many made it?" "All 17, Arisath said, barely above a whisper. "Who brought out all 17? Good." She pulled off her helmet. Her face was flushed, drenched in sweat, and she had a thermal blister forming along her left jaw line where the suit seal had failed near the end. She looked at it in a reflective panel. "That is going to be irritating." Arisath had treated burns before. He knew what third-degree thermal injury looked like. What he was seeing on her face was the beginning of a second-degree blister. Painful, yes, but her body was already responding, the inflammation controlled and deliberate. "That will scar," he said, unable to help himself. "Maybe," Yemisi said. "Does not matter. Get me the burn kit and let me look at Finn." Arisath processed what he had seen for a long time as he worked beside her. A species that willingly entered conditions incompatible with biological survival, not from recklessness, not from ignorance, but from a calculated decision that the mission mattered more than the personal cost. He had studied xenobiology for 11 years. He had never encountered a pain tolerance profile quite like this. He filed a report that night, flagged urgent, to the Therakene Medical Sciences Institute. The subject line read, "Human biological resilience, preliminary observations, please advise." He received a response 2 days later. "We are aware. We are studying. Do not underestimate them." Arisath stared at that last line for a while. Someone had already figured it out before him. He found himself wondering how many others were beginning to learn the same lesson. Orvaxis was a diplomatic platform, a conclave-built structure designed for exactly the kinds of conversations no one wanted to have in anyone else's territory. It rotated slowly in the dark between star systems, equidistant from 3 different faction boundaries, and it had hosted more uncomfortable silences than any other structure in known space. Ambassador Selim Voss had been sitting in uncomfortable silences his entire career. He was 61 years old, had survived 2 trade collapses and 1 actual shooting war, and had the patient, immovable energy of a man who had outlasted every crisis he had ever encountered simply by refusing to be rattled. Across the table from him sat High Diplomat Sherathondis of the Therakene Conclave, senior, experienced, formidable, and beside her, 2 silent advisors whose membranes had been cycling through nervous greens for the past hour. The Therakene had called this meeting. That in itself was unusual. They had called it specifically to discuss humans. "We have been reviewing our initial assessments of your species," Shirath said carefully. Her translator rendered her harmonics into precise, formal standard. "We find certain data points require clarification." "Ask what you would like," Selim said. Sheratha's membranes pulsed a cautious amber. "Your species' biological tolerance for damage. We have compiled field reports from Kellereth Station, from Therex 4, and from 14 other documented incidents over the past 2 years. In each case, human personnel demonstrated levels of function under physical trauma that our models classify as implausible." "Implausible," Selim repeated, his voice entirely neutral. "Your kind continues operating with injuries that would incapacitate most conclave species for days or weeks. Your wound repair begins within minutes of injury, not hours. Your pain response, while clearly active and functional, does not appear to produce the behavioral shutdown that biology predicts it should. We want to understand this." Selim was quiet for a moment. He had been briefed on this conversation before arriving. He knew what the Therakene were actually asking, not just the science of it but the implications. "You are asking whether you made a strategic miscalculation," he said. Sheratha's membranes went briefly, involuntarily white. "We are asking for biological clarification." "You are asking the same thing," Selim said not unkindly. "The Conclave graded humans as a Category 2 species on the Capability Index when we achieved FTL. That put us roughly equivalent to the early Virians, the pre-industrial Garati. You assumed we would need protection, guidance, time to develop. And we were, perhaps premature," Shirath said carefully. "You watched us for 40 years and built a model," Selim said. "You saw how fast we built ships, you called it reckless. You saw how much we fought among ourselves, you called it primitive. You saw how little we seemed to plan for disaster, you called it short-sighted." He folded his hands on the table. "What you did not measure was what happens to a human being when the disaster arrives anyway." One of the silent advisors leaned forward. His name was Theric Vess, a young intelligence analyst, and he had spent the past 8 months compiling every documented encounter between humans and crisis scenarios. The physiological data is extraordinary, he said. Your adrenaline response cascade is unlike anything in the conclave database. The speed of clotting factor deployment. The inflammatory response management. We evolved that way, Selim said simply. My species spent a very long time being hunted. And hunting. And surviving things that should have killed us. The biology is old. He paused. The stubbornness is older. Shirath studied him. You are not offended by this inquiry. No. Most species presented with evidence that another civilization had misclassified them would express displeasure. Would it change anything? Selim asked. You would still have the data. Better to talk about what comes next. This was, Tharagvest thought, an extremely human response. He had expected defensiveness or pride, or at minimum some performance of wounded dignity. He had gotten none of those things. Just calm pragmatism. What do you propose comes next? Shirath asked. Joint classification review, Selim said. Not just humans. Your species grading system has a lot of blind spots. You weight visible complexity, architecture, politics, economic structures. You weight them heavily. You weight endurance very little. Adaptability very little. The ability to absorb catastrophic loss and continue functioning, you do not even have a metric for that. Because no species we had catalogued possessed it to this degree, Tharagvest admitted. Then it is time to build one, Selim said. And while you are doing that, I would like to talk about the 14 sectors where conclave infrastructure is rated insufficient for the actual survival demands of the species living there. Because we have been doing informal audits and some of those numbers are troubling. Shirath stared at him. You came here expecting this inquiry. I came here prepared for it, Selim said. There is a difference. He produced a data chip and set it on the table. Human survival analysis of 12 conclave-administered colonial stations. Medical response inadequacy assessments. Structural failure scenario modeling. We have been doing this work for 8 years quietly because we kept seeing the gaps. We did not bring it forward because you had graded us Category 2, and Category 2 species do not present infrastructure assessments to the High Conclave. He pushed the chip across the table. We would like to be reclassified. The diplomatic platform rotated slowly in the dark. Outside, stars burned at their particular measured distances, indifferent to the conversation. Sherathondis picked up the chip. Her membranes ran through colors Tharagvest had rarely seen from her. Surprise, recalibration, something he might have called respect if he had been less cautious with his language. I will review this, she said. Thank you, said Selim Voss, and waited with perfect patience for whatever came next. Ravatha's Deep had been many things over its long history. A trading post, a fuel depot, a refugee station, and briefly a conclave prison facility before that particular experiment had been abandoned. Now it was a battlefield. The Keth Dominion, a militaristic species that had been probing conclave border territories for months, had seized Ravatha's Deep in a fast, brutal assault that had caught the station's garrison completely flat-footed. 300 conclave personnel were now pinned in the lower decks. A relief force had been scrambled, but it was hours out. The one thing nobody had anticipated was that the UES Cerathis, a human rapid response cruiser, happened to be 30 minutes away on a resupply run. Captain Mira Okeke did not spend much time deliberating. She had 71 Marines, a ship that was technically a support vessel rather than a warship, and a very clear view of the people who needed help. She went in. The Keth had 12 boarding-class fighters and approximately 400 ground troops. By any reasonable tactical calculus, the UES Cerathis had no business engaging them. Commander Varith Kalas, who happened to be on a diplomatic observation tour aboard the conclave relief vessel that was watching from safe distance, said as much to the conclave admiral beside him. The humans will be overwhelmed, he said. The force differential is too great. He watched his sensors. He waited for the Cerathis to fall back. The Cerathis docked at the station's emergency port instead. What followed was the most methodical, relentless, and frankly alarming 73 minutes Varith Kalas had ever observed. Sergeant Major Kira Abbasid led the first wave through the docking corridor with the kind of focused aggression that made the Keth soldiers watching through their sensor feeds hesitate just long enough to lose the choke point. She was bleeding from a cut above her right eye, a fragment from an explosive charge that had gone off prematurely, and she did not stop. Did not pause to assess the wound. Did not register it as a variable in her movement equations. She just kept advancing. Private Deo Tanaka took a kinetic round to the left shoulder in the third corridor. He went to one knee, got back up in approximately 4 seconds and continued operating. The Keth soldier who had shot him watched in visible confusion as his target simply declined to fall. Corporal Ayasha Nightwind took hits to her side paneling, suit breach partial, in the 7th minute. She sealed it herself on the move with one hand without breaking stride. Varith Kalas watched all of this from the sensor feed of the Conclave observation vessel and said nothing for a very long time. The Keth forces were well trained. They were well armed. They significantly outnumbered the human Marines. They were retreating within 40 minutes. Not because they were losing equipment. Not because their command chain had broken down. But because something in their tactical models had failed to account for an enemy that did not behave the way injured biological entities were supposed to behave. You plan around the moment your enemy breaks. Every species had that moment, the threshold where damage produced dysfunction. It was a fundamental truth of biological warfare. The humans did not seem to have a threshold. Or if they did, no one had found it today. Captain Okeke came aboard from a different direction entirely. A maintenance airlock that the Keth had not prioritized because it required crossing 30 meters of unshielded hull exterior in an environment suit. In the dark. Manually. While a battle was ongoing inside. She emerged inside the command hub with 2 Marines, secured it in under 3 minutes, and then established contact with the Conclave garrison commander in the lower decks with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done this before. She had not. This was, technically, the largest engagement she had ever personally led. You would not have known it. When the Keth commander transmitted a demand for terms, Okeke had sat in the captured command hub with blood drying on her temple and said calmly, "The terms are that you leave. All of you. Right now. And you do not come back." The Keth commander stared at her through the feed. "You are damaged," he said. It was a Keth assessment system, purely tactical. "Your forces have sustained significant casualties." "We are functional," Okeke said. "By what measure?" "By the measure that we are still here and you are considering leaving," she said. "That is the measure." The Keth left. Varith Kalas filed his own report to the Therakeen Conclave Science Council that night, sitting in the quiet of his observation berth with a view of Ravatha's deep growing smaller behind them as the relief fleet finally arrived, hours too late to do anything but count what had happened. The report was long. It covered physiological observations, tactical decision modeling, pain response analysis, damage to function ratio assessments. It cited every piece of data he had accumulated since Kellereth Station. At the end he added a personal note which was unusual for him. It read, "We have spent 40 years believing that human resilience was a curiosity. A biological quirk. An evolutionary remnant. I no longer hold this position. What I have observed is not a quirk. It is a doctrine. They have built an entire civilization around the premise that the mission continues regardless of personal cost. I do not know whether to find this admirable or frightening. I suspect the honest answer is both." He sent the report. Then he sat with his observation window for a long time watching the stars. Station Ellereth Prime was the most advanced medical research facility in the known conclave. 17 species had contributed to its construction. 49 different biological research programs ran concurrently within its walls. It had produced more breakthroughs in xenobiology than any other institution in history. It had never had a human patient before the day Sergeant Major Kira Abbasid arrived. She had been transported from Ravatha's deep under Joint Conclave Human Medical Authority, because the injuries she had sustained, which she had not mentioned during the battle, had not mentioned during the debrief, and had in fact only been identified when the post-action medical scan had caught things her own reporting had not, were significant enough that the Conclave medical staff had quietly, firmly insisted. 3 fractured ribs. A partially collapsed lung. A deep tissue laceration in her left side that had been bleeding internally for approximately 2 hours before the scan caught it. She had led a combat insertion, secured a command hub, and negotiated a Keth withdrawal with a partially collapsed lung. Dr. Theresa Ondival was the chief xenobiologist on duty when Abbasid arrived. She was Virian, a species known for calm methodical thought and a healthy skepticism toward dramatic claims. She read the scan results twice, then a third time, then looked at the human woman sitting on the examination platform looking moderately impatient. "You were aware of the rib fractures?" Theresa asked. "I was aware of something," Abbasid said. "It hurt. It kept hurting. I kept going. And the lung? That I did not know about specifically. I thought it was the ribs." Theresa processed this. The pain from 3 fractured ribs would be debilitating for most species. "It was pretty bad," Abbasid agreed. "I have had worse." Theresa's large, pale eyes blinked slowly, a Virian expression of careful recalibration. "You have had worse than 3 fractured ribs and a collapsed lung. Different incident. Does not matter." Theresa set her scanner aside and just looked at her patient for a moment. Abbasid looked back steadily, neither aggressive nor defensive, simply present, simply waiting. "We would like to study your healing process," Theresa said carefully. "With your permission. The reports we have received from field observers suggest your body's response to injury is not consistent with our models." Abbasid shrugged one shoulder. "Sure. You consent easily. If it helps you understand something useful, why would I not?" Abbasid said. "That is the point, is it not? Somebody learns something that helps somebody else. That is fine with me." Over the next 11 days, Station Elereth Prime's research staff, a team of 12 from 7 species, documented the healing process of Sergeant Major Kira Abbasid with the devoted attention of people who had discovered something they genuinely could not explain. The rib fractures began showing measurable calcification within 36 hours. By day 4, the internal laceration had closed without surgical intervention and without the level of pharmaceutical support that Therachine or Virion healing protocols would have required. By day 7, her lung capacity had returned to 83%. By day 11, she was running laps around the station's medical bay and asking when she could go home. Arisath, the same junior Therachine medic from Therex 4, now reassigned to Elereth Prime after his field report had attracted significant institutional attention, watched her running laps on day 9 and felt something he was not entirely used to feeling professionally: wonder. He fell into step beside her. She slowed to accommodate him. "I have been studying your species for 8 months," he said. "How is that going?" She asked not unkindly. "I keep revising my conclusions," he admitted. "Every time I believe I understand the mechanism, I encounter a new data point that reframes the previous ones." "What is the current conclusion?" Abbasid asked. Arisath considered the question carefully. "That we were measuring the wrong things," he said finally. "We measured output. Ships built. Territories claimed. Economic structures. We did not measure what your species does when it has nothing left. When resources are depleted, conditions are hostile, options are narrowed. That is where the real data is." "Adversity data," Abbasid said. "Yes, exactly." He was quiet for a moment. "Your evolutionary history was extraordinarily harsh. We know some of it. Your planet, the gravity, the pathogens, the competing predators, the climate variability. It was one of the more hostile environments we have cataloged for a species that achieved sapience. It made us weird," Abbasid said, and there was something in her voice that was almost fond. "It made you resilient," Arisath said. "In ways that we do not have good language for yet because we have not needed the language before." Theresa had been listening from the doorway. She stepped forward. "We would like to propose something," she said. "A formal research partnership. Human biology, human survival medicine, integrated into the Conclave's medical research framework. Not as subjects. As collaborators." Abbasid stopped running. She looked at Theresa for a moment, then at Arisath. Both of them were watching her with the particular attentiveness of people who had decided they had been wrong about something and were doing the work of correcting the error. "Talk to Ambassador Voss," Abbasid said. "He handles the formal arrangements." She paused. "But for what it is worth, yes. I think that is worth doing." She started running again. Theresa turned to Arisath. She agreed very easily. "She is practical," Arisath said. "They tend to be. It is one of the things I have come to admire." On the last day of her stay, as Abbasid was packing her kit and preparing for transport back to human space, Vareth Kalas appeared at the door of her room. She had not known he was at Elereth Prime. He had come, she learned later, specifically to be here for this moment. He stood in the doorway for a moment, membranes cycling through a slow, steady blue, a Therachine expression of something in the vicinity of respect. "Sergeant Major," he said. "Sub-Commander," she said. "I was at Ravatha's Deep," he said. "Observation vessel. I watched the engagement." "I know. It was in the debrief. I filed a report afterward," he said. "I have filed many reports about humans. I keep having to update them." "What is the current version?" Abbasid asked. Vareth Kalas was quiet for a moment. "Then, that we made a significant error in our initial classification. That biological endurance is not a lesser metric than technological complexity. That a species which builds its civilization on the premise that survival is always possible, regardless of what the conditions suggest, is a species worth knowing." Abbasid picked up her bag. "That is a better report," she said. "Yes," Vareth said. "It took me some time." She walked past him toward the transport corridor, then paused. "For what it is worth," she said, "we're just built this way. We did not plan it. It just happened to be what worked." She kept walking. Vareth Kalas stood in the corridor of Station Elereth Prime and watched her go. This small biological impossibility, this survivor, this human, and he thought about all the wrong measurements, all the miscalibrated models, all the conclusions reached too quickly and held too long. Then he pulled out his recorder and added a final note to the most recent version of his report. Do not make the mistake of measuring a species only in the bright moments. Measure them in the dark ones. That is where they show you what they are. The stars outside the station window burned steady and patient, as they always had, indifferent to the small and extraordinary things happening in the dark between them.